So this is the presentation on Ambrose Bierce, author of An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. So just to cover a little bit more than what you can read on your own, he was a journalist. That was where he spent the bulk of his literary career, although he wrote numerous short stories and some novels. He was largely a satirist and used cruel humor, and no one was outside of his sharp wit. He loved to point out hypocrisy and problems in society and really try to bring a sense of morality and justice into the world through his journalistic writing. He was very much a person who spoke out against oppression. He was pro-civil rights and for religious freedoms. He tended to be very, very critical of humanity's pretenses, our hypocrisies, anything that seemed to be immoral legally or politically in our institutions. Really nothing and no one was spared. He made a lot of enemies with his writing. At one point in his career, he was unemployed for over a year because of all the enemies he'd made, but he also made great friends. I mean, he was super good friends with Mark Twain, a famous American author who was also a satirist. So Ambrose Bierce enlisted in the Civil War for the North at 18, so that was in 1860. He fought for 5 years. Ultimately, he had a very traumatic head wound in 1865, which forced him to resign from the military. He suffered blackouts and dizziness to the point that he could no longer serve. This gives him first-hand war experience and is the subject of much of his writing and much of his famous writing, including Owl Creek Bridge. In 1867 is really when his journalism literary career began. He did dabble at times with other things, but that's kind of the start when he really began writing prolifically as a career. After a long, interesting career moving around the country, living in England, marrying, all the typical stuff, two of his children died, and he was very traumatized by that. He separated from his wife. She passed away. And so he set out for Mexico to be exposed to and see what was going on during the Mexican Revolutionary War, and actually was never heard of from again. He was last heard from in December 1913. Nothing definitive has ever been found about his death or what happened to him. Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is probably one of his most famous short stories. Kurt Vonnegut, American author, most famous for Slaughterhouse-Five, you may have seen the movie, if not read the book, said Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge was the greatest American short story. So that's pretty high praise. Another measurement of a story's success is, does it have an impact on pop culture? And the silent film The Bridge is based on the story that came out in 1929. There have been 2 Twilight Zone episodes, both in 1964, based on the story. And more recently, a Lost episode called The Long Con is based on the story. So kind of interesting when classic literature impacts pop culture. What should we be looking for in Owl Creek Bridge if we were thinking about doing a sort of literary analysis? There's a distortion of time. Why does that happen? How does it happen? How does he achieve it? What are the things that he does? How does he slow down time, both for the reader and in the moment of Peyton's death? A huge gap of perception versus reality. What do we know is true? What do we believe is true? And when you go back and do a reread of this story, things become much more apparent that something's not right than it is the first time. The first time you read it, you're very much drawn in to this suspension of reality. The ending of the story, the all is fair in love and war. Is that true? Is that really what Ambrose Bierce wants us to take away from the story? Or is there, again, the irony and the satire in that we know he's famous for? If there is, how do we write about it? What about it? So what? There's an amorality of war. War is without morals. Judging what is right or wrong in war, there's often a whole different code of ethics of what is right and wrong during war. Even at basest form, killing another person, technically murder, is somehow okay during war. So if you look at kind of those things, in the minds of the soldiers, this is justice. This is a traitor in the minds of the North. In the minds of the South, who is judge and jury? There's a ton of color symbolism in this story. If you go through and look for color symbolism, there is loads of examples. There's definitely irony. Juxtaposition means putting things in position together that are awkward or unexpected, kind of a comparative thing. If you juxtapose things, you put two things that shouldn't be together to a point or a purpose. The point of view of this is very interesting. In the first part, the point of view is third limited. We have an outside objective observer. Part 2, we become third limited with that objective observer. And part 3, we move into Peyton's head more so. Still third, but we become much more into his perspective and not so much the outside observer, which is partly why we are able to suspend the reality. The flashback structure itself, which would play into the distortion of time, why use that technique? To what extent, to what purpose and extent does that help the story? There's also a potential paper in the structure and symbolism all over of the story. The bridge, the North and the South, the between ideas. You think about the color gray, that's between black and white, between right and wrong. The story takes place between day and night. It takes place on a bridge, which is between the North and the South, which is between land, suspended in air, over water. There's all of this betweenness. What does that mean? Does it tie to a theme of amorality of war? Does it tie to something else larger? So there's some very interesting things that you can pursue in this story. Remember, this is a single event in a single day in a single subject in a single moment. Interesting. Takes place in northern Alabama. This bridge runs north and south over a river, one side controlled by the North, one side controlled by the South. So very interesting kind of things to look at when you are analyzing this story. Very short, kind of quick overview, but hopefully gives you some things that you could think about to find a way into this story for a literary analysis.